In 1836, deep in the hills of Kentucky, two 9-year-old girls walked into a wooden church and shattered an entire town's silence, with knowledge they should not have had of crimes no child should ever speak of, and of secrets buried so deep even the dead didn't dare whisper them. The floorboards still creaked with what they saw. Beneath the pulpit, under the weight of a forgotten cross, they pointed and said exactly what was hidden there, not just where, but why. A bottle, wrapped in a blue infant's blanket, and every man in that room went pale, because only one had put it there, and no one else was supposed to know. But they knew, every detail, down to the blanket's faded stitchwork. These weren't visions, they weren't stories, they were facts, precise, terrifying, verified. They called them the Morrison Twins, and in a forgotten corner of Appalachia, what they uncovered in 3 days still defies every known law of psychology, physics, and memory. You were never supposed to hear this story, and the men who first tried to publish it, their manuscripts vanished. The church where it happened, torn down, the grave markers, missing. But the journal, the pastor's journal, survived. Just long enough for one archivist in 1987 to blow the dust off its leather spine and open to a passage that would change his life forever. This isn't folklore, it's a chronicle of erasure, a record so precise that modern academics refuse to accept it, because if they do, it means our minds aren't what we think they are, that some children might be born knowing things they shouldn't, and worse, remembering things they were never told. This story is for those who understand that truth has always been more terrifying than fiction, that behind polite society, behind religion, behind everything we were told to believe, is a second world, older, crueler, and absolutely real. Before we go further, you need to understand something. After this video, you won't be able to forget what you've heard, and you'll never walk into a church again without wondering what's under the floorboards. Because some spirits don't haunt rooms, they haunt memory, and these twins, they didn't come to be seen, they came to remind. Pine Hollow was the kind of place that didn't change. Settled in the valleys east of the Cumberland Mountains, it was tucked so deep into the hills that even railroad maps left it blank. No telegraph wires, no official census, just a wooden church, a graveyard, and 24 families who'd built their lives on silence. But silence has weight, and in November of 1836, something came to lift it. Not with fire, not with violence, but with questions no one could answer. The twins arrived at dusk, Rebecca and Rachel Morrison, 9 years old, identical down to the curl of their hair and the pallor of their skin. But one smiled, the other stared, the kind of stare that made grown men drop their eyes. They came on foot, led by their father, Ezekiel, a traveling preacher with hollow cheeks and a voice like carved stone. He carried no luggage, only a worn satchel, and in it, a Bible, a journal, and an old photograph of a woman who no longer breathed. 3 days. That's all they stayed. But in those 3 days, they dismantled every secret the town had spent 2 decades burying. It began innocently enough. A dinner invitation, a question about a rose garden, a little girl wondering aloud whether the flowers had recovered after the blight 3 summers ago. The pastor's wife froze mid-spoonful, because that blight had never been spoken of outside the home, and yet the child knew, even the location of the garden and the exact color of the roses. But that was nothing compared to what came next. Rebecca began dreaming. Rachel began finishing her dreams, and then, before morning, they walked into the church and pointed to the exact floorboard beneath the altar. A board that 3 months earlier the pastor himself had pried loose and used to bury his shame, a bottle of whiskey wrapped in his dead son's baby blanket. No one had seen him do it, not his wife, not his congregation. He had sworn it was his cross to bear, a secret only God would ever know, until a child described it perfectly. He collapsed into his chair, shaking, because what had just happened wasn't magic, it was worse. It was memory, but not theirs. It was his, and they were pulling it out like string from a wound. On the second morning, something changed in the air. The frost came early, stiffening the ground and biting through coats. But it wasn't just the cold that made people stay inside. It was the way Rebecca looked at them now, not with the cheerful glow of a curious child, but with the calm detachment of someone remembering something terrible, something you hadn't even said yet, because she already knew it. The congregation was small, just under 200 souls, all of them tied to one another by marriage, old debts, and the suffocating weight of shared belief. They didn't need outsiders. They didn't want outsiders. And when outsiders came, they offered smiles with hands that never fully unclenched. But the twins didn't care. They moved through the church after service with perfect, terrifying grace, whispering fragments of secrets into the ears of grown men. A widow's lie, a farmer's theft, a hidden child, an affair. Each one landed like a stone thrown into a still pond. No accusations, no threats, just truth. And then silence. One by one, the congregation cracked open. Samuel Turner, the church's wealthiest man, dropped to his knees after Rebecca asked why he only stole the small bills from the offering plate, not the shiny coins. He began sobbing, begging the pastor for forgiveness before he even knew who had told her. Rachel wasn't as loud, but what she said was worse. She asked Martha Whitfield why her husband still wrote letters if he died in a farming accident. She described the handwriting, the way he always signed his name with a cross instead of a flourish, details no one could know, because those letters were hidden in the lining of Martha's sewing chest, and she'd never shown them to a soul. The air inside the church turned thick, like it was harder to breathe, not from smoke, but from knowing. The twins had no malice in their eyes, only recognition, like they weren't revealing secrets, just confirming what they'd already lived through. The people began to whisper the word possessed, but that wasn't quite right. This wasn't the devil's work. It was something older, something that remembered everything, even the things no one ever said aloud. Something watching. By the third day, the town had split into two camps, those who believed the girls were blessed, and those who were afraid they were a curse. But there was a third group, quiet, pale-faced, older, the ones who remembered, the ones who had spent 2 decades pretending they forgot. And when Rebecca stood before the altar that morning, her small hand brushing the wood with reverence, she didn't speak like a child. She spoke like someone unsealing a vault. "This is sacred ground," she said softly, "but it's been stained." She turned slowly to face them all, her voice never shaking. The Wittman family didn't die in a house fire. And that was when the blood drained from every elder's face in the room. They weren't expecting that. Because that lie was old. It was sacred in its own way, agreed upon, buried, etched into gravestones, told to children as history. But it wasn't true. The Wittmans, father, mother, and twin daughters, had vanished in 1818, just weeks after Pine Hollow was founded. The story passed down said a tragic fire had swept through their cabin during a lightning storm, and that nothing remained but ash and sorrow. A funeral had been held, graves dug, sermons preached. But something had always been off. The bodies were never recovered, the foundation was never found, and the storm that supposedly sparked the blaze never appeared in any of the local almanacs. Still, no one questioned it, because it was easier not to. Until now. "They died right here," Rebecca continued. "In this room, behind the altar. They were hiding, and someone found them." Pastor Phillips felt his knees weaken. His hand gripped the edge of the pulpit, not from guilt, but from the sudden understanding that he was standing atop a crime scene, that every sermon, every baptism, every prayer had been soaked in blood no one admitted was there. That's when Rachel spoke, a voice barely above a whisper. They screamed. A sound swept the room, Not a scream, not a word, just a collective gasp from those who had lived long enough to know that the twins were telling the truth. Elder Thompson stood, trembling, his cane rattling on the wooden floor. He didn't deny it. He simply asked, "How could you possibly know that?" Rebecca looked up at him. "Because they remember," she said, "and they're still here." She said it with no malice, no pride, just certainty. They're still here. And for a moment, every person in that chapel felt it, that slight pull in the air, like the room had just exhaled after holding its breath for 2 decades. No wind, no storm, just presence. Then Rebecca began to list details, one by one. Faith had a birthmark on her shoulder. Hope had one on her ankle. Faith clutched a doll carved from hickory. Hope wore a silver locket with her mother's hair tied in a braid. The night they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress. Hope was sick. She was in her nightgown. Gasps turned to whimpers, because every single detail was true. These weren't vague impressions or lucky guesses. They were facts. Personal, intimate, hidden facts. The kind of memories that should have died with the Wittmans and with the people who buried the truth. Rebecca paused. Rachel stepped forward. They weren't burned. They were beaten. Someone dragged them into the church, thinking it was safe. They begged to be hidden. They didn't want to leave the valley, but they knew something. A cold silence fell. Rachel's eyes darkened. They saw something they shouldn't have. It was then that the old stories began to surface. Not spoken, not yet, but remembered. That Jacob Wittman, the father, had threatened to write to the authorities, that he had learned something about the land deeds, about forged signatures, about stolen church money, and that days after voicing his suspicions, his entire family vanished in the fire no one ever saw. It was never about the storm. It was about what they knew. And now, it was back. In the voices of 2 little girls who had never met them, who were born nearly 2 decades after they died, who described every sound, every smell, every unmarked corner of a room they had never stepped into, until now. Dr. Hayes finally spoke, high, his voice clinical but thin. "When we rebuilt the eastern wall, we found bone fragments in the mortar. The room turned to ice, and for the first time in his life, Pastor Phillips wished he didn't believe in God, because if God was real, then so were ghosts." Dr. Hayes stood rigid as the weight of his confession sank into the room. 3 years ago, he repeated, when we were repairing the eastern wall, we found what looked like bone, mixed with the mortar. Not old animal bone, human. No one spoke, not even the pastor. The church, that modest wooden structure raised by trembling hands and whispered hymns, had just been transformed. It wasn't holy anymore. It was a tomb. The congregation looked down at the floor beneath their feet like it might suddenly move, like someone might knock back. Because if what Rachel and Rebecca said was true, if the Wittman twins had been dragged here, hidden behind the altar, and then never left, then everything they'd ever believed about this place had been built on a lie layered in blood and plaster, and that's when the others began to speak. Not loudly, not proudly, but like men confessing on a scaffold. Samuel Turner's lips trembled. "My father. He told me to never speak of that family, that they left. That was the story we agreed on. I was just a boy." Mrs. Carter stepped forward, one frail hand covering her mouth. "There were stains," she said, "on the boards. Red stains that wouldn't go, even after scrubbing with lye. We just painted over them." Elder Thompson, shaking now, dropped his cane. "I was there," he whispered. "I didn't see what happened, but I saw what came after. The church was locked for 2 days. When it opened, no one mentioned the Wittmans again, and the whole town just accepted it." Rachel's voice broke through the stillness. "They didn't just die, they were silenced." Her sister nodded. "They weren't supposed to be remembered, but they remember themselves." And just like that, the cold came back. Not wind, not weather, a presence. It moved through the pews like breath down the neck, a weight pressing between the shoulder blades. Hairs on every neck stood, not from fear of the girls, but from the sense that someone else was in the room, watching, waiting, not for revenge, for recognition, for someone to finally say the truth aloud, because the dead don't haunt the innocent, they haunt the ones who pretend it never happened. And this church, this whole town, had been pretending for far too long. The walls felt closer now, not physically, spiritually, as if each board had leaned in to listen, to bear witness, because truth, once spoken, doesn't leave quietly. Rebecca sat at the edge of the altar, swinging her feet like a child bored of recess. But her eyes stayed fixed on the back of the room, on someone no one else could see. Rachel didn't move. Her hands were folded in her lap, her chin tilted down. But when she finally spoke again, her voice cut deeper than any sermon. "They were scared," she said. "Not of death, of betrayal." No one asked who she meant. They already knew. For years, Pine Hollow had existed on the illusion of righteousness, on purity, God, and Baptist doctrine, on sermons about sin and repentance, recited by men who never once repented what they did in the dark. But the twins, they saw through it, not with anger, not with fire and fury. That would have been easier. They saw through it with silence, with facts, with memory. It's one thing to hear a prophet cry judgment from the mountaintop. It's another to hear a child say your secrets aloud, in your own voice. Because that's what it felt like. When Rachel spoke, it didn't feel like being accused. It felt like remembering. The Miller family left first, quietly, no eye contact. They gathered their son, the one they'd hidden upstairs for years, too ashamed to show the neighbors his slowness, and they slipped out the back door without a word. Then came the Carters, followed by the Whitfields, and soon a tide of townspeople began to exit the chapel, not in anger, but in something worse. Shame. It was the unraveling of a community built on false sanctity, one confession at a time, and the Morrison twins didn't have to say another word. They just sat and watched, like scribes of a history that had already been written, waiting for everyone else to admit they knew it too. Only Pastor Phillips remained, his hands trembling as he opened his Bible, only to find it unreadable, not because the words had changed, but because for the first time in his life he questioned who had written them, and whether the God he prayed to every morning had been listening at all, or whether someone else had been listening instead. When the last of the congregation had left the chapel, the room fell into a silence so pure it felt manufactured, like someone had placed glass over the building, sealing sound away. As if the church itself had been waiting for this moment, only 4 people remained. Pastor Phillips, Ezekiel Morrison, his daughters, and a presence they didn't dare name. The pastor turned to Ezekiel, his mouth dry, his voice a whisper barely holding its weight. "You knew this would happen," he said. Ezekiel nodded once. "It always does." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick, choking, familiar. Phillips moved toward the altar, slowly, his footsteps echoing now, echoing differently. He crouched beside the 3rd floorboard, the one the girls had identified days earlier, and pulled it loose with a flat iron kept hidden in the hymnal drawer. The wood groaned, and beneath it, just as described, was the bottle, wrapped in a blue infant's blanket. His fingers touched the cloth. His breath hitched. It was real. Every detail the girls had spoken was real. Not just the bottle, not just the cloth, but the meaning behind it, his shame, his private failure, a sin wrapped in innocence, buried beneath the feet of the faithful. Rebecca spoke, her voice small. "We don't want to hurt you. We only remember what others hide." Philip stared at the twins, his hands still holding the bottle. "But how?" he asked. "Why you?" Ezekiel stepped forward then. For the first time, his voice cracked, not from age, but from weight. They were born the night my wife died, he said, in a blizzard, the kind that erases tracks, time, even thought. We were alone, miles from help. She bled, too much. I held her as she passed. She whispered, "They come from fire, but not from me." And then she was gone. Phillips swallowed hard. What fire? Ezekiel stared at the altar. I used to think she meant the storm, but now I believe she meant another fire, older, one that burns behind the world, a memory that doesn't forget, a flame that writes everything down, even the things men think they've buried. He looked at his daughters. They were born from that. Ezekiel's words lingered like heat rising off scorched earth. A flame that writes everything down. Pastor Phillips stared at the twins, his mind fracturing at the edges, because deep down a small voice in him, the one he'd silenced for years, whispered something he had always feared. That memory is not just a function of the brain. It is a force, a witness, a punishment. And some children are born not as vessels of memory, but as its servants. Rebecca stood now. She moved to the altar and placed her palm flat against the old wood. This isn't a church anymore, she said. It's a grave marker. Rachel joined her, speaking almost in unison. And they don't want justice. They want acknowledgement. Phillips collapsed onto the pew behind him. He could feel it now, the presence. Not demonic, not divine, just aware, deeply aware, of every lie ever spoken beneath that roof. And then came the voice, not from the twins, not from Ezekiel, not from any throat at all. It came from the walls, a low groan, not wood bending, memory stretching. The church was responding. Phillips tried to speak, but his throat closed. He remembered what Samuel Turner had said earlier, that these children were speaking nonsense. But now, even Turner was gone, fled, like so many others, because what was happening could no longer be denied. The church had been built on secrets, and secrets rot. Ezekiel opened his journal, the same leather book he'd carried for over a decade, and handed it to Phillips. This happened before, he said, in 3 other towns. They weren't always this young when it started, but the pattern is the same. They arrive, people confess, truth comes up like a weed through a grave, and the place changes. Pastor Phillips opened the book with shaking hands. Inside were names, dates, sketches of buildings, margins filled with notations about dreams, whispers, warnings. Every entry ended the same way. Left behind ashes. He looked at the girls. You mean fire? Rachel shook her head. No. People burn it down. Silence. Rebecca met his eyes. Because some places can't survive the truth. And that's when he realized the church, the one his ancestors built with their bare hands, was already condemned. Not by fire, by memory. The fire outside hadn't started yet. But inside Pastor Phillips, it already burned. He held the journal like it was poison, not because of what was written inside, but because of what it confirmed. The Morrison twins weren't unique. They were consistent. Their knowledge wasn't accidental. It was methodical. And the pattern had a name. Ezekiel never spoke it aloud, but he had written it over and over again in the margins of his entries. In a script so tight and jagged, it looked more like scratching than writing. The remnants. Rebecca saw him reading it and tilted her head. It's not our name, she said, answering the thought he hadn't spoken. It's what people start calling the ones who know, the ones like us, who remember what others try to bury. Rachel added, We don't always stay long. Most towns don't let us. Ezekiel stared into the dying embers of the chapel stove, his face hollow. I used to think I was guiding them, that my preaching mattered. But the truth is, they were guiding me. I go where they're pulled, where the forgetting is deepest. Phillips closed the journal. There were others? Ezekiel nodded. They don't all live long. Not because they're ill, but because people can't stand to see themselves through the eyes of innocence. The guilt poisons the air, the whispers get louder, until someone snaps. His voice lowered to a whisper. There was a town in Tennessee. One of the girls, not mine. She was barely 12. They found her hanging in the schoolhouse. Said it was suicide. He paused. It wasn't. Rebecca's voice cut the silence. She told them what happened to the missing children, what the mayor did in the cellar. They said she was lying. Rachel whispered, "She wasn't." Pastor Phillips felt the walls closing again. The pressure, the judgment, but not from God, from something older, because this wasn't divine retreat. It wasn't a test of faith. It was arithmetic, cause and effect, sin and consequence, lies and exposure. And the twins, they weren't here to prophesy, they were here to balance the ledger. Rachel stepped toward him. "Mr. Phillips," she said gently, "if you don't want it to burn, you have to tell the truth before they light the match." He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. The match hadn't been struck, but the room already smelled of smoke. Not wood smoke, moral smoke, that invisible haze that rises when truth has nowhere left to hide and the lies start burning themselves from the inside out. Pastor Phillips stood slowly. The journal felt heavier now, not metaphorically, physically. His hands trembled beneath it, as though the weight of every unspoken confession it contained had become a real burden. Paper soaked in secrets, ink that knew too much. He looked at Rebecca. "You said you don't always stay long. What happens when you do?" Her eyes narrowed. "Then we see how deep the rot really goes." Rachel, still motionless, added, "And how long people are willing to pretend the smell isn't there." It wasn't poetry. It was diagnosis. Phillips closed his eyes. He thought of every whispered conversation that had stopped when he entered the room, every funeral with a missing cause of death, every child who'd moved away, though no letter ever came, every man who beat his family with a belt and called it discipline, every stolen coin, every forced silence. He knew deep down that Pine Hollow was no different than the other places the twins had visited. It just wore a better mask. Ezekiel approached the altar and knelt, not in prayer, but in exhaustion. "They see things," he murmured, "but they also feel them. The weight of what's been done. It doesn't come with visions. It seeps through the walls, through skin, like ash that never washes off." Rebecca nodded. "We remember people better than they remember themselves." Rachel finally turned to the stained glass window. "Some churches are built on worship, others on denial." Phillips was silent for a long time. Then, with trembling hands, he stepped behind the pulpit, not to preach, but to confess. He told them everything, not just the whiskey, not just the blanket, but the other secret, the one he had buried deeper. About the child born out of wedlock, the one his wife never knew. The girl sent away to a convent 3 counties east, the way he had pretended she never existed, for the sake of appearances, of status, of righteousness. The girls didn't judge him, they simply nodded. Rachel whispered, "She still dreams of you." And that was when Pastor Phillips collapsed, not from guilt, from release. Outside, a wind had started. Not a breeze, a movement. The kind that brushes the edge of your coat, but somehow doesn't touch your skin, because it's not aimed at the body. It's aimed at the soul. Inside the chapel, Pastor Phillips knelt alone behind the pulpit, face buried in his hands. Not in shame, not in prayer, but in surrender. It wasn't the act of confession that broke him. It was the understanding that someone, something, had always been listening. Rebecca watched him closely. Her expression wasn't cruel, it was surgical, as if she wasn't watching a man fall apart, but watching an infection finally rise to the surface where it could be cut out. Rachel looked toward the door. "They're coming," she said calmly. Ezekiel stood. "Who?" Phillips asked hoarsely. The twins spoke in perfect synchrony, their voices identical, unnervingly steady. "The rest of them." Pastor Phillips turned toward the window. "Torches. 5 of them, maybe 6, carried by men who once sat in his front pew. Men he had baptized, married, buried their mothers, and now they were coming not to speak, but to erase." He stepped back from the pulpit. "I'll talk to them," he said. "I'll reason." "You can't," Ezekiel interrupted. "They've already chosen the fire." Because that's what always happened, not with pitchforks and shouting, but with torches in trembling hands, with whispers that turned into doctrine, with fear disguised as righteousness. The twins didn't bring the fire, they just made it necessary. Rachel turned to her sister. "It's time." Rebecca nodded, walked to the front pew and pulled a small piece of parchment from her satchel. It was covered in tight, looping script, not written by her, but kept by her. Preserved. She handed it to the pastor. "What is it?" he asked. "Their names," she whispered. He stared down at the list. It wasn't a list of townspeople. It was the names of every person who had ever entered that church with blood on their hands and left with clean collars. Names of men long dead, women still walking, children who had grown into perpetrators. "How? How did you know?" Rebecca looked out the window where the torches flickered closer. "We don't know," she said. "They tell us." Phillips finally understood. The fire wasn't punishment. It was a cleansing, and it was already too late to stop it. The torches didn't arrive in a frenzy. They came with calm hands and quiet eyes, the kind of eyes that have already decided what needs to be erased. 6 men, 2 women, all familiar, all changed, not in face, but in posture. These weren't protectors of the faith. They were curators of the lie. And when they stepped into the chapel doorway, there was no shouting, no wild accusations, just silence. The kind that tightens the chest and shortens the breath, not because of danger, but because of certainty. They had come to end the memory. The lead man, Thomas Brett, stepped forward. His voice was measured, practiced. "Pastor Phillips, we need to ask those girls to leave, tonight." Rebecca looked at him. Her gaze didn't blink, didn't flinch. "You mean you need us to disappear?" Thomas hesitated. "No. We mean, this place isn't safe for anyone." Rachel whispered behind her sister, "You mean it's no longer safe for lies?" Ezekiel stood between them. "You know what they've said is true," he said. "You knew before they arrived." Thomas clenched his jaw. "That's not the point." It was Martha Whitfield, white-haired, shaking, who stepped forward and said what they all truly meant. "The point is, no one else can know." Phillips felt his stomach turn. It wasn't about protecting the town. It was about preserving its mask. The congregation hadn't collapsed because of the girls. It had collapsed because it had been hollow for years. The twins had simply knocked on the door. Now the town wanted to torch the house. The fire wasn't an act of rage. It was maintenance. Rachel said it softly, but clearly. "They will not stop at us." And Rebecca added, "They never do." That was when Thomas raised the torch slightly, not toward the twins, but toward the floor, toward the altar. Phillips stepped forward. "You'd burn the house of God?" Thomas's voice was cold. It hasn't been his house for a long time. Behind him, someone struck a match. The smell came first, then the sound, the crackle of judgment, not from heaven, but from men. Not divine punishment, human denial. This was how truth was handled in Pine Hollow. Not with repentance, with fire. The match was small, insignificant even, a flick of sulfur, a single breath of flame. But when it touched the edge of the hymnal left at the base of the pulpit, it lit with a fury that was far too fast, too hot, too eager, as if the very air inside the church had been waiting for this spark. Wood groaned, smoke rose. The altar, soaked in 2 centuries of polish, prayer, and pretense, caught fire like it was dry grass, and in seconds the front of the chapel was glowing with an orange, pulsing rage. Thomas Brett dropped the matchstick and stepped back. He didn't flinch, because he believed, like all false priests do, that destruction is a form of cleansing. Pastor Phillips stared in horror. He could hear the crackle of flame, the popping of old nails, the sigh of a building giving up its breath. But louder than all of it was the silence of the twins. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They watched, not as victims, as witnesses. Rachel stepped forward, firelight dancing in her pale eyes. "This doesn't destroy the truth," she said. "It only moves it." Rebecca added, "You don't kill a memory by burning the place it happened. You just make it stronger." Phillips tried to move toward them, but Ezekiel held him back. "No," he said. "They have to stay." The fire climbed the pulpit. Smoke coiled upward through the rafters like a serpent, not chaotic but deliberate, as if something long buried was finally rising for air. The others, the ones with the torches, began backing out of the chapel. One by one, quietly, like men leaving a crime scene. But Phillips didn't move. He watched the flames crawl toward the eastern wall, toward the mortar where bones had been found, and felt something inside him fracture. Not his faith, his obedience. Because for the first time, he saw it clearly. The church wasn't burning down. It was being revealed. The fire wasn't judgment. It was exposure. And exposure, true, raw, skin-stripping exposure, was what the twins had always brought. Not prophecy, not punishment, just light. And light is the only thing liars truly fear. The fire didn't roar. It whispered. It moved through the chapel like a slow revelation, peeling back wallpaper, swallowing pews, licking at the rafters as if tasting every lie etched into the wood. And still, the twins did not flinch. Rebecca stood barefoot now, the hem of her dress beginning to curl from the heat. Rachel's hand rested in her father's, her eyes fixed on the flame like it was speaking directly to her. Pastor Phillips coughed through the smoke, desperate to find breath. "Why aren't they running?" he rasped. Ezekiel didn't answer right away. Because he knew. They couldn't. Not because they were physically trapped, but because they were bound, not by fire, but by memory. "This is their place now," he said finally, "until it finishes." "What finishes?" Ezekiel turned to the pastor, his eyes hollow. "The reckoning." The ceiling cracked. A beam fell, shattering the altar. A burst of sparks erupted into the rafters. The cross, the one hand-carved by the town's founders, tilted forward, then dropped into the blaze, and with it, the last symbol of sanctity burned. Rachel finally spoke. "Now they remember." Rebecca nodded. "They know what happened." Phillips didn't ask who they were, because in that moment, he felt it. Them. Not spirits, not visions, but impressions. Shadows. Fragments of people who had been forgotten. The twin girls, Faith and Hope. Their mother. Their father. Faces once erased by silence, now etched into flame. Not haunting the church, reclaiming it. The truth had found form, and its form was fire. Outside, the villagers watched the chapel burn, some with tears, some with clenched fists, some with nothing at all. The blank stare of people who know the world has changed and that no prayer can make it small again. Inside, Ezekiel turned to Phillips one last time. "History doesn't forgive," he said. "It just waits for a witness." And the Morrison twins? They didn't scream. They didn't speak. They simply stepped forward into the flames and vanished. No heat touched their skin. No smoke choked their lungs, because what was burning wasn't a building. It was the mask, the town's mask. And once the mask is gone, only memory remains. By morning, the church was gone. Nothing left but blackened stone, warped iron nails, and a scent that clung to the lungs, not of ash, but of judgment. A hollowed ground where once sermons were shouted now held only the sound of wind threading through skeleton beams. No bodies were found, no bones, no trace of the twins, just a scorched patch beneath the altar where the wood burned hotter than anywhere else. The shape was strange, circular, as if something had ignited from below. Pastor Phillips stood among the embers. He was the only one who returned. The others, the men with the torches, the women with tight mouths, the children shielded from truth, stayed behind the tree line, watching, waiting, hoping the silence would return like it always did. But it didn't, because once the truth is spoken aloud, it becomes unburnable. Phillips knelt near what had once been the third floorboard, the hiding place for his whiskey and his regret. Now reduced to charcoal and dust, he opened Ezekiel's journal again. But this time, something was different. The ink had changed. Where once there had been sketches of towns and names scrawled in haste, there were now full sentences he didn't remember reading. Words that described him, his secrets, his daughter, his confessions, even the things he hadn't yet spoken aloud, as if the journal had kept writing after Ezekiel left, as if the fire hadn't erased the memory. It had fed it. He read one line again and again, unable to look away. The ones who see are never burned, because fire is not their enemy. Forgetting is. Behind him, wind stirred through the ash. He thought he heard a voice. Not the girl's, not Ezekiel, his own. A younger version, crying out in guilt, in shame. Memory had returned, and memory had claimed its due. There were no miracles in Pine Hollow that week, just a reckoning, a pulling up of the roots, the hidden, ugly roots, beneath what the town once called holy. And as Phillips rose and walked away, he knew something had changed. Not in the earth, in him, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The town moved on, or at least, it pretended to. Within weeks, a new chapel was proposed, simpler, smaller, practical they called it, a place to gather, to rebuild, to forget. But forgetting no longer worked, because something had shifted, not in the soil, not in the sky, but in the mirror, the one every man now avoided, the one that reflected not just faces, but histories. Men began speaking more softly. Wives clutched their rosaries with white-knuckled desperation. Children, once told bedtime stories of angels and sin, now whispered of twins, one who smiled, one who stared, both who knew too much. And Phillips? He never left the ruins. He built no new sermons, took no new confessions. He simply sat in the ash and read the journal over and over again. Each time the words seemed different because they weren't changing. He was. By the second month, he started seeing it. The pattern. The reason Ezekiel had called them remnants. Not because they were fragments of the past, but because they were what survives after truth is burned. He flipped back through the pages. Tennessee, 1829, Mississippi, 1831, West Virginia, 1833, each story the same. A town, a chapel, a silence, two children, a fire, and always the same aftermath, a place stripped of its mask, a hollowing, a reckoning. A few souls changed, most left untouched, still clinging to the belief that forgetting equals survival. But forgetting is a luxury, and the remnants were born to bankrupt it. Rachel had said it before the fire, you don't kill a memory by burning the place it happened, you just make it stronger. Now he understood. The twins weren't here to haunt the guilty, they were mirrors. They showed people who they really were, beneath the hymns and handshakes. And if people rejected that reflection, the fire came, not as punishment, but as the final reveal. Phil, IPS, looked up from the journal. The sky was gray, the wind quiet, and somewhere in the hills he swore he heard a girl's voice, laughing, not cruelly, just remembering. By the third month, Pine Hollow had rewritten its own history. Again. The official story was simple: a fire caused by faulty wiring in the stove. No one injured, nothing lost but an old building in need of replacing. A small column appeared in a Lexington newspaper, just a few lines. No names, no mention of the Morrison Twins, no mention of the ledger, or the voices, or the bones in the wall. Because that's how denial works. It doesn't scream. It whispers, until it becomes truth. The town resumed its rituals. Sunday gatherings, casseroles, marriages beneath carved wooden arches. A new pastor, younger, louder, took over for Phillips, whose absence was labeled a sabbatical. But something had rotted in the foundations of the community. Not physical rot, moral rot. The kind you can't scrub with bleach or bury beneath hymns. Children started waking at 3 a.m., talking in their sleep, describing girls in white dresses, saying things their parents swore they'd never been told. "They say I'm not lying," one child whispered. "They say it happened here." Parents blamed nightmares, the school blamed ghost stories, but deep down, everyone felt it. The chapel was gone, but the memory remained, and memory doesn't forget just because you close your eyes. Pastor Phillips, now considered a recluse, never returned to the town proper. He lived in a cabin at the edge of the forest. No sermons, no visitors, just the journal and his own thoughts. Until one night, a package arrived. No name, no return address. Inside, a drawing. 2 girls, one smiling, one staring. At the bottom, a note in a child's uneven hand. "We see you still remember. Good." Phillips dropped the note. His fingers trembled. Because the handwriting matched an entry in the journal from a town he'd never visited, in a year before the twins were even born. This wasn't coincidence. This was continuity. That was the moment he understood. The remnants weren't just children. They weren't just twins. They were a force, older than language, older than grief. A memory that could wear any face so long as it was needed. It was buried beneath the ruins, a simple carving, faint, half-burned. At first, no one saw it. The townsfolk had cleared the debris, removed the blackened beams, and leveled the ground where the chapel once stood. Plans had already been drawn for a new structure, but then one of the workers, a boy no older than 16, found it. A circle, with 3 lines etched through its center, 1 vertical, 2 horizontal, crossed like veins through a body. It looked ancient, primitive, but also deliberate. The boy told no one. He simply sat and stared, because when he touched it, only briefly, his nose began to bleed. He collapsed 10 minutes later, unconscious. He awoke hours after dusk, and when he did, the only thing he could say, over and over until his voice cracked, was, "They're not gone." The town medic chalked it up to exhaustion, heat stroke, overwork. But Pastor Phillips, he recognized the mark. He had seen it before. In the back of Ezekiel's journal, sketched in charcoal, drawn over and over like a man trying to remember a symbol from a dream. Beneath the sketch, just one sentence: "This is the seal of unforgotten places." Phillips copied it onto parchment, stared at it for hours, and as he did, he began to hear whispers. Not hallucinations, not ghosts, memories. Whispers of the Wittman girls, of what they saw that night behind the altar, of what the congregation did, of who stayed silent, but also of other towns, other fires, other voices. He pulled out a map and marked the symbol's location. Then he turned to the entries in the journal. Tennessee, Mississippi, West Virginia, all towns, all burned, all with no known cause. And in every case, 2 children were recorded present. Always different names, always the same pattern. Twin girls, born after a storm, carried by a man with gray in his beard and grief in his eyes. The replacements weren't people. They were memory-made flesh. They didn't come to punish. They came to balance the scales, and Phillips knew what must come next. He took a knife, carved the symbol into his own doorframe, and then he lit a candle and whispered the phrase the girls had said before they vanished into the fire. "We do not accuse, we remind." The candle flickered. Then it steadied. The air in Pastor Phillips' cabin changed, thickened, like pressure dropping before a storm. The moment the phrase left his mouth, the silence inside the room became alive, not loud, but aware. "We do not accuse, we remind." The words weren't magic. They were permission. Permission for something ancient to stir, not a spirit, not a ghost, something worse, something honest. He felt it move behind him, not footsteps, not breath, just presence, the kind you feel when someone is watching and knows you, fully, beyond masks, beyond confessions, beyond the Sunday face you wear to avoid judgment. Phillips didn't turn around. He spoke again. "We do not accuse, we remind." And then he saw it. The journal, open on the table, had changed. Again. Where before there were scribbled dates and old entries, there was now a new page, blank at first. Then words appeared, written in a soft, looping hand, the same hand as the note from the package, a child's hand. "If they light the fire again, make sure they remember why it burns." He stepped back, his eyes wide. Because below the message, the parchment began to darken, not with ink, but with heat. A slow burn mark, rising from the paper like it had touched the edge of an invisible flame. And in the center, a new name. His own. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Once you speak the phrase, once you invite memory back in, you don't get to leave the ledger blank. The remnants weren't sent. They were called. By broken men trying to fix their own rot. By communities that buried truth too deep to reach. By fires that started long before the matches were struck. And now that Phillips had spoken the words, it meant something was watching him. He closed the journal, extinguished the candle, and whispered to himself, "Remember this phrase. Say it with me, now, twice." In the comments, to mark that you've crossed over, "We do not accuse, we remind." We do not accuse, we remind. Because once you say it, you'll start to see. And after that, there's no going back. They're not just stories. The pattern, the remnants, the fires, the silence that precedes the scream, it's happened before, over and over, scattered like dropped pins across a map no one wants to look at closely. Phillips started researching them, not just through Ezekiel's journal, but through courthouse records, newspaper obituaries, fragments of half-burned Bibles and town logs that skipped just the right years. He found 12. 12 towns erased not by disaster, but by denial. Each one shared the same marks. A chapel older than the rest of the town. A tragedy involving children. An absence of photographs. And a sudden, unexplained fire. The archives used different words. Electrical faults, lightning strikes, acts of God. But Phillips knew better. These weren't acts of God. They were acts of memory. And in every case, there were reports. Subtle, buried in letters to editors, or tucked inside the margins of private diaries. Of children. Always twins, always girls. Names changed. Faces lost. But always the same feeling described. Like they already knew me. Like they were remembering something I hadn't told anyone. Like I'd already confessed, and they were just confirming it. In one account, from a town outside Vicksburg, a pastor wrote, "They stared at me with such peace, not judgment, just understanding. I don't think they hated me, but I think they saw me, and I think that's worse." In another, "We buried the wrong bodies. We built a church over a lie. When the fire came, I didn't run. because I knew it was mine. Phillips began drawing a new map, a private one, with the symbol carved beneath each town's name, the circle, the 3 lines, the seal of the unforgotten. The more he looked at the map, the more he realized it wasn't random, it wasn't chaos, it was surgical. Each fire removed a town that had let silence fester past the point of redemption. The twins didn't cause the destruction, they were simply summoned by it. Not everyone who remembers is chosen, only the ones who buried too much. And when enough truth dies in one place, something older comes to dig it up. Phillips once believed in salvation. He believed in stained glass, in confession booths, in the redemptive power of guilt spoken aloud. But the remnants didn't ask for confession. They never demanded repentance. They asked only for one thing, recognition, and when that didn't come, the fire did. By the time he finished his map, 12 towns were marked. But the symbol didn't just connect locations, it formed a pattern, a spiral, winding in on itself, not expanding outward like a plague, but tightening inward like a noose. At the center, a name, Ashridge. Not a town on any modern map, no records in federal archives, no train routes, no population count. But Phillips found it, buried deep in the state library under decommissioned settlements. Founded, 1802, abandoned, unknown. Reason, not listed. Last known inhabitant, a preacher named Wesley Ambrose. That name haunted him because Ezekiel had underlined it 3 times, in red ink, in a journal that had never once used color. Phillips dug deeper, parish logs, obscure theology journals, and there, in the dusty back page of a forgotten Lexington Seminary quarterly, he found a passage. Ambrose had been excommunicated for publishing a private doctrine, a theory. He called it the Theology of Remnants. The page included only fragments, but they were enough. There are places that cannot be forgiven. There are sins that cannot be buried. Where memory sleeps too long, it begins to wake as fire. And those who see it are not prophets, they are mirrors. Phillips dropped the book, because it wasn't just a theology, it was a warning. Ambrose had seen them too, before Ezekiel, before the fire spread, before the journal ever existed. And then he vanished. No obituary, no grave, just a burned chapel in an unlisted town. Phillips understood now, these weren't isolated incidents. This was a system. An old one, a balancing force that didn't care about prayer or forgiveness or what you meant to do. It only cared about what you buried. And if too many people lied in one place for too long, the remnants came, not as revenge, as reminders. Pastor Phillips traveled to Ashridge. He told no one, packed nothing, just the journal, a lantern, and a small hand-drawn copy of the remnant symbol, the circle and 3 crossing lines. He didn't know what he expected to find, but what he felt as he crossed into the forgotten valley was undeniable. Stillness. Not quiet, suppression. Like the air had been pressed down by something heavy for generations. No birds, no wind, just trees. And the outlines of what once was a town. Ashridge was rubble. Stone foundations overtaken by moss. A bell tower half swallowed by ivy. And at its center, a square of scorched earth, perfectly rectangular, like something had once stood there and was forcibly removed. It wasn't marked on any survey, not even as ruins. No plaques, no fences, just absence. But Phillips recognized it instantly. The shape, the direction it faced, the slight indentation where an altar would have stood. It had been a church, and it had been erased. He lit the lantern and walked the perimeter. That's when he saw it, etched into a crumbling stone by hand, like someone had scratched it just before the fire. We do not accuse, we remind. Below it, 2 names, faded, nearly gone. Grace and Mercy. Twins, another pair, born into a town that no longer exists, names swallowed by soot. History cracked from the stone, but they had been real, and someone before the end had carved those names, not as a memorial, but as a warning. Because it wasn't about them, it was about the truth they carried. The memory they refused to let die. Phillips knelt and placed his hand on the stone. The surface felt warm, though the air was freezing. He didn't speak, because he understood something now. Something Ezekiel had known for years, but never written plainly. The remnants weren't summoned by evil, they were summoned by silence. Every lie told, in the name of keeping the peace. Every secret passed down like heirloom shame. Every child taught to forget instead of ask. It built something, brick by brick, and when it was tall enough to block out the light, they came to tear it down. Phillips didn't move. His hand remained pressed against the scorched stone as if trying to absorb something, not heat, history. He could feel it beneath his skin now, like ash soaked into blood. He wasn't alone. He hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard a sound, but he knew. He was being watched, and not by something outside the trees, from beneath them. Not a spirit, not a ghost. Something heavier, something that didn't float or drift or whisper. Memory. Because once truth is buried long enough, it doesn't fade. It gains weight. And the unspoken, it calcifies, becomes structure, architecture. It turns into crooked family trees and rewritten town records and funeral sermons filled with lies. Phillips closed his eyes. He remembered his first baptism as a young preacher, a girl named Clara, 8 years old. Her father stood behind her like a statue, silent, cold, and after the service, she whispered something to Phillips that made his blood run cold. He says I shouldn't tell what happened in the barn. He reported nothing, told himself he'd misunderstood, that he had no proof, that it wasn't his place. Clara died 2 years later. Fever, they said. But Phillips had buried the truth long before they buried her. And now, kneeling at the edge of Ashridge, he felt her name press against his chest like a branding iron. This was the truth. The remnants come not just for towns, they come for individuals, for those who participated in silence, for those who benefited from forgetting. And now he understood why Ezekiel never stayed in one place. Because once you walk with memory, once you carry it, you can't rest. You become the match in your own pocket, and sooner or later, you strike, not in vengeance, in necessity, to make sure no one pretends the walls were never there. Phillips opened the journal again. One more entry had appeared. In that me looping hand, you are now one of us. Your silence has been broken. Speak carefully, or the fire will choose for you. He stood, looked out over the dead town, and whispered to no one and to everyone, I will not bury the truth again. The walk back from Ashridge felt longer, not in distance, in weight, as if every step added a stone to his back. Pastor Phillips didn't speak, didn't think. He simply listened. Because somewhere behind the wind, beneath the rustle of leaves, inside the silence between footfalls, he heard them, the girls. Not screaming, not sobbing, speaking. Not to him, through him, like his body had become an instrument and they were learning how to play it. The voice came first through thought, fragments of phrases echoing like remembered dreams. Tell them what happened, even if they don't want to hear it, especially if they don't. By the time he reached his cabin, his ears rang with static, the kind that comes before an old radio locks onto a signal. He opened the door. The room was cold, but the journal was warm, and the fireplace, unlit when he left, was glowing. Inside the hearth, not wood, but pages were burning. Old sermons, old letters, old ledgers, all the things he'd once used to protect himself, all the records of carefully crafted half-truths meant to keep the town from unraveling. They were gone, and in their place on the mantelpiece sat something new, a stone, flat, smooth, carved with a symbol. Not the circle and the lines this time, but a hand, open, with two eyes etched into the palm, one crying, one staring. Below it, etched in the wood, We only come to those who can still feel shame. He fell to his knees, not from fear, from clarity, because now at last he understood the final piece. The remnants weren't just meant to reveal hidden sins, they were meant to mark the ones who could no longer lie to themselves. That was the test. That's why some were spared and others consumed, not based on guilt, but on reception. Did you see the truth? Did you speak it? Did you change? Or did you light another match? In that moment, Phillips heard their voices again. This time, not in his head, not through pages. Behind him, in the room. Rebecca, you remembered. Rachel, now you begin. He turned, but they were already gone, leaving only silence and the unbearable weight of having been seen. After that night, nothing around him changed. The cabin still stood, the birds still sang, the townspeople still smiled when they passed him on the trail, too polite, too fearful, too willfully blind to ask what he had found. But inside him, everything had shifted. Because once the remnants touch you, once you've heard their voices and felt the weight of truth cracking through your ribs like lightning in timber, you don't go back to the old world. You see its seams. You hear the echoes. And Phillips began to realize the echo follows you in empty rooms, in closed books, in the second before you fall asleep, when your body is at peace, but your mind is suddenly wide awake, remembering the thing you said wasn't important, the thing you buried. That's when they whisper again, not to haunt, to remind. Because the remnants don't speak in guilt, they speak in recognition. Phillips started dreaming in patterns, not stories, not people, maps. 12 burned towns, one erased. A spiral forming a shape, not a symbol of doom. A pathway, a loop that always led back to a single truth. The more a town lies to itself, the closer the fire creeps. The more a man hides from his past, the louder the knock at his door. He began writing letters, anonymous, careful, left in the backs of churches and on courthouse steps. Each one ended the same way. Do not ask if the twins are real. Ask if your silence is worth what it will cost, because they are listening. And if they come, you will not be warned again. He never signed them. He didn't need to. The remnants leave their own signature. It's not a name, not a phrase, not even a fire. It's the moment you feel eyes on you, and no one is there. The moment your child says something they shouldn't know. The moment your dreams start repeating a place you've never been. It's not madness, it's memory. And memory, once awakened, never sleeps again. One town escaped. Only one. Of the 13 Phillips traced through Ezekiel's journal, 12 had been reduced to blackened stone and silence, but one remained, untouched, unharmed, unburned. A place called Darrow's Hollow. No chapel fire, no missing twins, no mass exodus, just records that quietly stopped in 1842 and then picked back up 30 years later under new leadership, new names, and a suspiciously rewritten charter. It didn't fit the pattern, so Phillips went there. He expected ruins. What he found was worse. A thriving community, beautiful homes, quiet streets, people who smiled too wide, who spoke with the same stiff cadence, who watched him without blinking. It took only a day to realize something was wrong. Every window was clean, every door freshly painted. No children played outside, no one aged. And in the church, a tall, pristine structure at the hilltop, he found portraits, dozens, of children, all twins, all smiling. Each pair framed in gold, hung in the sanctuary where a crucifix should have been. And below each portrait, a plaque, not with names, but with dates, always 3. Date of arrival, date of revelation, date of silence. Phillips ran his hand along one of the frames. Cold. Too cold. The name below read, Rebecca Rachel, received, heard, contained. That was when he noticed the final wall, hidden behind a red curtain. He pulled it aside. What lay behind wasn't a painting. It was a mirror. A full-length slab of black obsidian, polished, flawless, ancient. Etched across the top, "They will not burn what they can cage." He staggered back, because in the reflection he saw not himself, but Ezekiel. Standing behind him, then gone. The remnants had come to Darrow's Hollow, but they hadn't been consumed. They had been imprisoned, bound, contained, muted. The town had changed the rules, not to but to control, and for the first time Phillips understood there are fates worse than fire. Darrow's Hollow didn't just survive the remnants, it weaponized them. Pastor Phillips didn't sleep that night. He stayed inside a borrowed inn room with his back to the door, watching the windows, the cracks in the walls, the unnatural stillness of the town. There were no crickets, no dogs barking, no sounds of life. Because Darrow's Hollow wasn't living, it was preserved, like a museum. And the remnants, the girls whose voices once burned down chapels and exposed entire generations of guilt, had been trapped here, not with chains, with ritual. In the basement of the chapel, Phillips found it, the containment. Behind an iron gate and layers of locked doors, sealed with wax, blood, and old scripture rewritten into bindings. Every verse twisted, every blessing hollowed out and inverted. A circle carved into the floor, identical to the symbol Rebecca once drew, but altered. 3 lines crossed by a 4th. He understood immediately. They had broken the symmetry. Where the remnants had always followed a pattern, arrival, truth, fire, vanishing, Darrow's Hollow had intervened. They interrupted the rhythm. Instead of letting memory burn away the rot, they had turned it into fuel. The portraits in the chapel, they weren't paintings, they were seals. Each one anchoring a fragment of memory, a piece of the remnant's knowledge, frozen in time, inaccessible to the world but stored for safekeeping, and then used for control. Phillips found documents, dozens of them, letters between town elders, confessions of blackmail, proof that people from other counties had been summoned here, drawn in, observed, dissected, their secrets harvested, their histories recorded, and then erased from the outside world. Darrow's Hollow wasn't a sanctuary. It was a library of sins, curated, filed, and bound. Phillips ran his hands along the stone walls and felt it humming, a low subterranean pulse. The memory wasn't dead. It was trapped. And he understood the final horror. The remnants had always offered one gift, the chance to confess before fire came. But here, they were denied even that. This was the first town where no one had to face their truth, because someone else held it for them. Under lock, under script, under threat. And that, Phillips realized, was worse than forgetting. It was possession. It was the smiles that shattered him. Too perfect, too calm. Everyone in Darrow's Hollow walked like they were being watched. But not by God, not even by one another, by the walls. Phillips passed a group of teenagers, each one identical in posture, voice, cadence, all twins. But none of them looked at him, not really. Their eyes passed through him like light through stained glass. Empty, unburdened. Not by innocence, but by design. They hadn't forgotten their sins. They'd never been allowed to know them. Because Darrow's Hollow had perfected the lie that every town wished it could believe. That guilt is optional. That memory is a disease, and obedience is the cure. He returned to the chapel, to the mirror. to the stone slab that should have reflected him. But now it was showing something else. Not Ezekiel, not the twins, but Phillips himself, older, weathered, dressed in the very robes worn by the man in the old photos labeled Council Elder. He stepped back, heart racing. The mirror didn't follow him. It remained frozen, as if showing not his reflection, but a prediction. He turned, and there on the wall, a message had appeared beneath the obsidian. The fire cleans. The cage controls. Choose. That's when he realized the town wasn't thriving because it avoided fire. It was thriving because it fed on memory. Secrets were currency. History was a ledger. And the remnants weren't just prisoners here. They were power sources. Philip stumbled down into the basement again, deeper this time, and saw it, a vault lined with candles that never burned out. And in the center, 2 chairs, tiny, empty, waiting. He knew what it meant. Darrow's Hollow hadn't just captured Rebecca and Rachel. They were waiting for the next ones. Because once a town learns how to bottle memory, how to enslave confession, it no longer fears the eminence. It replaces them. And if the world ever stops burning, it's because this model has spread. A society that doesn't forget, because it doesn't allow remembering. He left Darrow's Hollow before dawn, didn't speak, didn't breathe deeply, just walked, as if the road behind him might swallow him whole if he stopped moving. The journal tucked beneath his coat had begun to change again, not just with new entries, but with new rules. Written in handwriting he didn't recognize, written like doctrine, not prophecy. Warning: when memory is chained, guilt becomes ritual. When guilt becomes ritual, truth dies quietly, and when truth dies, the fire does not return, only the mirror does. Phillips walked until his legs gave out, collapsed beside a creek, slept without dreaming for the first time in years, and when he woke, the journal was open. It had flipped itself. To a page labeled simply, Doctrine of Dread. He read every line, and you're about to hear it too. Because this is the unspoken law beneath all others, the truth behind every remnant story, every fire, every whispered phrase that echoed through towns that thought they were untouchable. This is what those in power always fear most. Doctrine of Dread. Article 1. Memory is not chemical. It is structural. It has mass. And when mass is suppressed, it seeks release. Article 2. Every lie builds pressure. Every silence tightens the valve. And when enough silence gathers, something must open it. Article 3. The remnants are not anomalies. They are exhaust ports. They arrive only where memory has been disrespected. Article 4. Fire is not punishment. It is clearing. It removes rot the way lightning clears a diseased tree. Article 5. The mirror is worse than the fire. The fire ends the lie. The mirror reflects it back. Forever. Article 6. Towns that burn may forget. Towns that cage the truth become it. Phillips dropped the book. It was no longer just about the twins. It never had been. They were faces worn by something older, something built into the fabric of memory itself, a force that existed before time, that doesn't forgive, that doesn't punish, that simply remembers. And when memory isn't honored, it incarnates as children, as dreams, as fire, as mirrors. Now you understand, this isn't a horror story, this is a survival manual. And your town might already be on the list. Pastor Phillips returned to his cabin and sealed the journal beneath the floorboards. Not to hide it, to pause it. Because some truths burn so hot, even knowing them begins to unravel your sense of self. But the mirror, it never paused. It followed him, in puddles, in window panes, in the reflection on a blade he used to carve firewood, and every time he caught sight of it, he didn't see himself. He saw people, others, men in suits behind pulpits, women behind closed doors with ledgers, teachers who looked the other way, children who grew into quiet men and whispered wives, and obedient citizens who buried things so deep they forgot they once knew. The mirror wasn't literal, it was epidemic. And Phillips realized something far worse than fire, far worse than guilt. There are people, entire towns, who have learned to live with the reflection, who wake each morning, look into the face of their own lies, and smile. Because some don't fear the remnants. They invite them, as leverage, as insurance, as symbols of control. Darrow's Hollow was just the prototype. There were more, places where confession is staged like theater, where secrets are currency, where the truth isn't forgotten, it's owned, trapped in vaults, sold in whispers, measured in favors. Phillips began calling them the Dread Towns, not because they were afraid, but because they had learned to manufacture fear. He returned to his journal one final time and wrote, "Fire is honest, mirrors lie beautifully, and only those who've touched both can tell the difference. Because this is the final stage of the remnant's path. Not towns that resist, not towns that burn, but towns that reflect. Places where you can see the truth and feel nothing. No shame, no anger, no memory, just routine, just control, just peace, so pristine it feels wrong. If your life is too quiet, if your mirror has started to flicker, if your children speak of people who don't exist, you are not haunted, you are being recruited." The map is complete now. Phillips didn't finish it with his hands. It finished itself, as if the ink had a memory too, one that stretched across centuries, through fires, through sermons, through the silence of entire generations. And when the final dot was marked, the pattern emerged like a scar beneath peeling paint. Not a line, not a web, a spiral, winding inward, not toward a center, but toward a threshold. Because this was never about a single town, it was about something gathering. Each remnant visitation wasn't random. Each fire wasn't reaction. It was installation. Every time truth surfaced and the fire followed, something ancient recorded it, logged it, wove it into a greater design, a system, a memory architecture. And Phillips realized, this spiral wasn't warning us. It was calling them, not just the twins, not just Ezekiel, but every soul who had ever cracked beneath the weight of secrecy and let a little truth bleed through. The confessor, the mourner, the child who accidentally told a truth their parents had locked away, the ones who remembered even when no one else did. The remnants were never anomalies. They were responses, autonomic, instinctual, as natural as the body rejecting poison. And if the spiral is real, if it continues closing, then one day it will complete. And when it does, the fire won't come for a town. It will come for the world that taught itself to forget. That spiral is closing now. You've seen it, haven't you? In the repetition of history, in the way old sins wear new suits, in the way your generation blames the last while copying its script in real time. And deep down, in the places you don't say aloud, you know something's coming, something not quite divine, but not quite human either, something ancient, not angry, just awake. And when it stands before you, it won't shout, it won. It'll punish. It'll look like a child, and it will ask just one question. Why did you bury it? And what you say next will decide if the fire comes or the mirror. There is no twist ending, no salvation arc, no heroes standing at the edge of town shouting truth into the void while the people wake up cheering. Because this story wasn't meant to save you, it was meant to prepare you. Pastor Phillips disappeared 3 years after finishing the journal. Some say he burned with another chapel, a final reckoning in a place whose name has been lost. Others claim he walked into a fog near the Appalachian Ridge and never returned. But those who know better, they say he left the spiral, became part of it. Because once you've seen the pattern, once you've held memory in your hands and understood it's alive, you don't get to go back to ordinary life. You either carry the fire, or you become the mirror. There is no in-between. The remnants still walk. Not as ghosts, as tests. They appear in classrooms, asking teachers questions they weren't ready for. They sit beside old men on park benches and whisper things only dead wives knew. They step into church pews and look the preacher in the eyes, not accusing, not demanding, remembering. And what you do in that moment determines what comes next. Because the spiral isn't just a map, it's time, and it's tightening. You felt it, haven't you? The sense that something is wrong, not just in the world, but beneath it. That history is repeating, not like a wheel, but like a scream bouncing off stone walls in a sealed room. That's the spiral closing, and when it does, the ones who forgot will face the mirror. The ones who buried will feel the flame. But the ones who remembered, who spoke the truth even when their voices shook, who said, "We do not accuse, we remind. We do not accuse, we remind." Those people, they are already inside the spiral, already walking the edge, already awakening others. So ask yourself, when the remnants come to your door, and to, "Hey Will," which will you face? The fire or the reflection? And if your voice trembles when you answer, you already know the truth. Because memory isn't just what we keep, it's what keeps us.